China's response was the most dramatic. President Tsai announced that the Belt and Road Initiative would be completely restructured to ensure genuine partnership with participating nations. Chinese projects in Africa would be jointly managed with African partners and profits would be shared more equitably. The paternalistic attitudes of the past were replaced with respect for African capabilities and priorities. The United Nations became a battleground for the new approach to international relations. African nations formed a coordinated bloc that demanded equal representation in the Security Council and other decision-making bodies. They refused to accept policies imposed by wealthy nations without meaningful African participation in their development. The transformation was visible in every international conference and diplomatic meeting. African leaders who had previously accepted marginal roles now demanded equal time and equal respect. They came prepared with detailed proposals and professional presentations that challenged assumptions about African capabilities. Young Africans watching these changes felt a pride in their continent that their parents had never experienced. University students organized conferences on African leadership and international relations. They studied Ibrahim's tactics and discussed how to apply his lessons in business politics and international cooperation. Social media platforms were flooded with content celebrating African achievement and potential. Young Africans created videos explaining their continent's contributions to science, technology, and culture. They challenged stereotypes and demanded that the world recognize Africa as a continent of innovation and capability rather than poverty and dependency. The economic implications were transformative. African nations began coordinating their resource policies to ensure fair prices for exports. They demanded technology transfer and local processing, rather than simply shipping raw materials to be processed elsewhere. The days of colonial-style resource extraction were ending as African leaders insisted on genuine economic partnerships. International corporations scrambled to adjust their African operations to meet new demands for fair partnerships. Companies that refused to adapt found themselves replaced by competitors willing to offer genuine respect and equitable terms. The business world learned that treating African partners with dignity was not just morally right, but economically smart. Viktor Petrov sat in his Russian prison cell reading newspaper articles about the transformation he had accidentally triggered. His racist outburst had destroyed his own criminal empire while helping to create a new era of African dignity and international respect. The irony was lost on him, but it was clear to everyone else that his moment of hatred had helped birth a movement of hope and empowerment. The other members of his criminal organization faced similar fates. Their network of corruption and exploitation across West Africa had been completely dismantled. Local officials who had been on their payroll were facing prosecution. The illegal mining and smuggling operations they had controlled were shut down permanently. Putin's decision to defend Ibrahim's honor had evolved far beyond punishment for criminal behavior. It had become a comprehensive strategy for building genuine partnerships with developing nations based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. Russia found itself welcomed in countries that had previously been suspicious of Russian intentions. The transformation extended beyond Africa. Nations in Latin America, Asia, and the Pacific began demanding similar respect from major powers. The success of Ibrahim's partnership with Russia had shown that small nations could negotiate as equals with superpowers if they had the courage to demand dignity. International law schools began teaching courses on the Traoré Doctrine, named after Ibrahim's approach to demanding equal treatment in international relations. The principle was simple but revolutionary: treat all nations with respect, regardless of size, wealth, or military power, and structure all partnerships for mutual benefit rather than exploitation. The old world order based on colonial relationships and dependency was dead. In its place emerged a new system where respect and dignity were the foundations of international cooperation. Nations that embraced these principles found themselves with stronger, more sustainable partnerships, while those that clung to old attitudes of superiority found themselves increasingly isolated. The rain was falling hard on the tin roof of Amadou Sankara's small motorcycle repair shop. It was getting dark outside, and he was working late to finish fixing an old Honda bike. The owner needed it first thing in the morning for work. Amadou wiped the sweat from his forehead and smiled, thinking about going home to his wife Fatima and their little boy, who was only 2 years old. Fatima was pregnant again, and the baby would come soon. Life was simple but good for the 25-year-old mechanic. Amadou had built his small business from nothing. He started with just a few basic tools and a dream to support his family. Every day he worked from sunrise to sunset, fixing motorcycles and bicycles for people in his neighborhood in Ouagadougou. His customers trusted him because he was honest and his prices were fair. He never cheated anyone and always did good work. The shop was tiny, but it was his pride and joy. It meant freedom and hope for a better future. As he tightened the last bolt on the motorcycle, Amadou heard loud voices outside. Heavy footsteps splashed through the puddles in front of his shop. Before he could even look up, 3 police officers burst through his door. They were soaking wet from the rain, and their faces looked angry and mean. The leader was a big man with cold eyes who seemed to enjoy scaring people. "You are Amadou Sankara," the big officer said. It was not a question. He already knew the answer. "Yes, sir," Amadou replied. His heart started beating fast. He had done nothing wrong, but police in Burkina Faso were known to cause trouble for innocent people. "How can I help you, officers?" "You are under arrest for stealing government vehicles," the officer announced. 2 other policemen moved closer to Amadou. "You have been selling stolen cars and motorcycles across the border to Ghana." Amadou's mouth fell open in shock. He had never stolen anything in his entire life. He worked hard for every penny he earned. "There must be some mistake," he said. His voice was shaking. "I only fix motorcycles and bicycles. I have never stolen any vehicles." The big officer laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Tell that to the judge," he said. "We have evidence that proves you are guilty. Witnesses saw you loading stolen vehicles onto trucks at night." "That is impossible," Amadou protested. "I am here in my shop every day. My neighbors can tell you. My customers know me. I would never do such things." But the officers did not want to hear his explanations. They grabbed his arms roughly and put handcuffs on his wrists. The metal was cold and tight against his skin. Amadou felt like he was living in a nightmare. This could not be happening to him. Just minutes ago, he was thinking about going home to kiss his wife and son goodnight. "My tools," Amadou said, looking around his shop. "My business. What will happen to my family?" "You should have thought about that before you became a criminal," the big officer said. He pushed Amadou toward the door. The rain was still falling, and it felt like ice against his face. As they walked to the police car, Amadou saw some of his neighbors watching from their windows. Their faces showed shock and confusion. These people knew him. They knew he was not a thief, but the handcuffs on his wrists told a different story. In their eyes, he was already guilty. The police car was old and smelled like cigarettes and fear. As they drove through the dark streets toward the police station, Amadou's mind raced. Who would do this to him? Why would anyone want to destroy his life? He thought about Fatima waiting at home for him to return. She would be worried when he did not come back for dinner. She would never imagine that her husband was sitting in the back of a police car, accused of serious crimes. At the police station, they threw Amadou into a small dirty cell with several other men. The smell was terrible, and there was only one small window high up on the wall. Some of the other prisoners looked at him with curiosity, while others ignored him completely. This was his first night as a prisoner, and he did not sleep at all. He kept thinking this was all a mistake that would be cleared up in the morning. But morning brought no relief. The same big officer came to his cell with a huge smile on his face. "Your trial is next week," he said. "I hope you have a good lawyer because you are going to need one." Amadou realized then that this was not a mistake. Someone had planned this carefully. Someone wanted him to disappear from his normal life and go to prison. But he had no enemies. He had never hurt anyone. The truth would come out eventually. It had to. Innocent people did not go to prison for crimes they did not commit. He was so very wrong about that. The metal gates of Koudou Central Prison made a loud screaming sound as they opened to swallow Amadou forever. The trial had been a joke that lasted only 2 hours. His lawyer was a sleepy old man who barely spoke during the entire hearing. The judge seemed bored and kept looking at his watch. When they announced 25 years in prison, Amadou felt his legs go weak. 25 years. He would be 50 years old when he got out. His children would be grown adults who barely remembered their father. The prison guard who processed him was a mean-looking man with scars on his face. He took away Amadou's clothes and gave him a torn gray uniform that smelled like it had never been washed. The fabric felt rough against his skin and was too big for his thin body. Other prisoners watched him with empty eyes as he walked through the corridors. Some looked curious, while others seemed to have given up on life completely. "Welcome to hell," whispered an old prisoner as Amadou passed by. The man's teeth were mostly gone, and his hair was white as snow. "Hope you brought your own food, because what they give us here will kill you faster than the guards will." Amadou was taken to cell block C, where he would spend the next 25 years of his life. The guard opened a heavy metal door and pushed him inside. What he saw made his stomach turn over. The cell was built for 6 people, but had 18 prisoners crammed inside like animals. There was barely enough space for everyone to lie down at the same time. The smell hit him like a punch in the face. It was a mixture of unwashed bodies, human waste, and rotting food that made him want to throw up. The floor was concrete and felt cold even though the air was hot and thick. There were no real beds, just thin mats that looked like they had been used by hundreds of prisoners before. A bucket in the corner served as the toilet for all 18 men. Flies buzzed around it constantly, and the smell never went away no matter how much prisoners complained. "You can sleep there," said a young prisoner pointing to a tiny space near the door. "But watch out for the rats at night. They like to bite toes." The young man looked like he had been in prison for years, even though he seemed to be only 20 years old. His eyes were old and tired, like someone who had seen too much suffering. The food in Koudou prison was worse than anything Amadou had ever imagined. Once a day, guards brought a bucket of what they called rice. It was usually spoiled and mixed with dirty water that had bugs floating in it. Sometimes prisoners found pieces of metal or stones mixed in with the rice. Many inmates got sick from eating the terrible food, but there was no doctor to help them. Sick prisoners just had to suffer until they got better or died. Water was even harder to get than food. The prison had only one tap that worked, and hundreds of prisoners had to share it. Men would fight over their turn to fill small containers with the brown liquid that came out. The water tasted bad and made many people sick, but it was better than dying of thirst. Amadou learned to wake up very early to get his share before the stronger prisoners took it all. The guards at Koudou were as cruel as wild animals. They seemed to enjoy making prisoners suffer. They would beat men for no reason at all or demand money that prisoners did not have. If someone complained about the terrible conditions, the guards would put them in solitary confinement where they would slowly go crazy in the darkness. Some guards would steal food from prisoners or sell clean water to those who could afford it. At night, the cell became even worse. 18 men trying to sleep in a space meant for 6 created constant problems. Some prisoners snored loudly while others talked in their sleep about the families they missed. The concrete floor was so hard that Amadou's bones ached every morning. Mosquitoes would bite him all night long, and he had no way to protect himself from them. During his first week, Amadou watched a sick prisoner die slowly in the corner of their cell. The man had been coughing blood for days, but no guard would help him. Other prisoners tried to share their tiny portions of food with him, but it was not enough. When he finally died, it took the guards 2 days to remove his body. The smell was horrible, but they all had to live with it. This was Amadou's new world, a place where innocent men were treated worse than animals. A place where hope came to die. While Amadou suffered behind the cold prison walls, his wife Fatima was fighting her own battle for survival. The night he was arrested, she waited by the door until sunrise, holding their sleeping 2-year-old son. When morning came and Amadou did not return, she knew something terrible had happened. A neighbor finally told her that police had taken her husband away in handcuffs. The words hit her like lightning from a clear sky. 3 months later, Fatima gave birth to their daughter completely alone. The labor pains started in the middle of the night, and there was no money for a taxi to the hospital. She walked the long distance through empty streets, stopping every few minutes when the pain became too strong to bear. At the hospital, nurses treated her badly when they learned her husband was in prison. They whispered among themselves and gave her looks full of judgment and disgust. The baby girl was beautiful and healthy, but Fatima cried when she held her for the first time. This innocent child would grow up without knowing her father. She would ask questions that would break her mother's heart. Fatima named the baby Aika, which means life, because she needed something to give her hope in these dark times. With Amadou gone, money became a serious problem very quickly. The motorcycle repair shop had been their only source of income. Without him there to work, customers stopped coming and the business died. Fatima had to sell all the tools and equipment for much less than they were worth. The money helped for a few weeks, but it was not nearly enough to support 2 children alone. The landlord showed no mercy when Fatima could not pay the rent. He gave her 1 week to find the money or leave the house. She begged him to wait, explaining that her husband was innocent and would return soon. The landlord laughed in her face and said all prisoners' wives told the same lies. When the week ended, he threw all their belongings into the street and changed the locks on the door. Fatima had no choice but to move back to her mother's tiny mud house in a poor part of town. The old woman was already struggling to feed herself and now had to share her small space with a daughter and 2 grandchildren. The house had only 1 room and a kitchen that was falling apart. The roof leaked when it rained, and there was no electricity or running water. Every day became a fight to find enough food for the children. Fatima took any work she could find, no matter how difficult or poorly paid. She washed clothes by hand for wealthy families until her fingers were raw and bleeding. She cleaned houses from morning until night for a few coins that barely bought rice for dinner. She carried heavy loads at the market, sold small items on street corners, and did whatever people would pay her to do. The hardest part was not the physical work or even the hunger. It was the shame that followed her everywhere like a dark shadow. When people learned her husband was in prison, they treated her like a criminal too. Neighbors who used to greet her warmly now crossed the street to avoid her. Mothers would not let their children play with her son and daughter. At the market, some vendors would refuse to sell to her or charge her higher prices. Her son, who had been a happy, laughing child, became quiet and sad. He would ask every day when Papa was coming home. Fatima did not know how to answer. She could not tell a 3-year-old that his father might be gone for 25 years. Instead, she would hug him and say Papa was working far away, but still loved him very much. Little Aika grew up never knowing what it felt like to have a father's strong arms around her. She saw other children with their fathers and wondered why hers was missing. When she was old enough to understand, the neighborhood children would tease her and call her the daughter of a thief. She would run home crying and ask her mother if it was true. Fatima managed to visit Amadou only twice in 20 years because the prison was far away and travel cost money they did not have. Each visit broke her heart more than the last. Her strong, handsome husband was becoming a thin shadow of himself. His eyes looked empty and hopeless. She could see that prison was slowly killing his spirit, even though his body was still alive. At night, after working all day and putting the children to bed, Fatima would sit alone and cry for the life that had been stolen from them. She never stopped believing in her husband's innocence, but belief could not put food on the table or give her children the future they deserved. In September 2022, something unusual started happening in Burkina Faso that would change everything for prisoners like Amadou. News traveled slowly into Koudougou prison, usually through new inmates or guards who liked to gossip. The first whispers spoke of a young military captain named Ibrahim Traoré, who had taken power from the corrupt government. Most prisoners paid little attention because they had heard similar stories before about new leaders who promised change but delivered nothing. But this time felt different somehow. The guards who usually strutted around the prison like kings seemed nervous and uncertain. They were talking quietly among themselves and looking over their shoulders as if they were afraid someone might be watching them. Some of the crueler guards had stopped beating prisoners for no reason. A few had even started being polite when they handed out the terrible daily meals. One day, a new prisoner named Musa arrived from the capital city of Ouagadougou. He was young and still had fire in his eyes that prison had not yet killed. During his first night in the cell, he shared news that made even the oldest prisoners sit up and listen carefully. He told them about Captain Traoré's speeches on the radio where he talked about fighting corruption and serving the people instead of stealing from them. "This one is not like the others," Musa said with excitement in his voice. "He talks about justice for all citizens, rich and poor alike. He says the courts have been bought and paid for by criminals who should be in prison themselves. He promises to review cases of people who were wrongly convicted." The other prisoners looked at each other with expressions of doubt mixed with desperate hope. They had heard politicians make similar promises during election campaigns. The promises always disappeared after the votes were counted and the new leaders moved into their comfortable offices. But something in Musa's voice made them want to believe that maybe this time could be different. Amadou listened to these conversations without saying anything. After 20 years of disappointment, he had trained himself not to hope for anything. Hope was a dangerous thing in prison because it made the daily suffering even worse to bear. It was easier to accept that he would die in this cell than to dream about freedom that would never come. But over the following weeks, more signs appeared that suggested real change might be happening. The prison director received several unexpected visits from government officials who asked detailed questions about conditions and prisoner records. These were not the usual corrupt inspectors who could be bought with a few bribes. These visitors took photographs, made notes, and seemed genuinely shocked by what they saw. Radio broadcasts from the government started talking about reforms to the justice system. Captain Traoré gave speeches promising to investigate corruption in the courts and police. He spoke about innocent people who were suffering in prison, while the real criminals lived freely in their stolen mansions. For the first time in years, prisoners were allowed to listen to these broadcasts without punishment. The most surprising change was in how the guards started treating prisoners. They were still not kind, but they were no longer as cruel as before. It was as if they had received orders to stop the worst abuses while investigations were happening. Some guards who had been especially brutal were suddenly transferred to other prisons or disappeared completely. New prisoners continued to arrive with more encouraging news from outside. They told stories about corrupt officials being arrested and put on trial. They spoke of investigations into cases where evidence had been fabricated or witnesses had been paid to lie. Some mentioned a special commission that was being formed to review wrongful convictions throughout the country. Even the prison warden seemed different. He had always been a cold man who cared nothing for prisoner welfare, but now he was asking questions about living conditions and medical care. He ordered repairs to the leaking roof and arranged for clean water to be delivered more regularly. These were small changes, but they felt like miracles to men who had been treated like animals for years. One evening, as Amadou sat in his usual spot by the window watching the sunset, his cellmate Omar sat down beside him. Omar had been in prison for 15 years and was one of the few people Amadou still talked to occasionally. The older man had a thoughtful expression on his weathered face. "I have been thinking about what the new prisoners are saying," Omar said quietly. "Maybe we should not give up hope completely. Maybe this Captain Traoré really is different from the others." Amadou looked at his friend with tired eyes. "I have heard these stories before, Omar. New leaders always promise to help prisoners. Then they get busy with more important things and forget about us completely. But what if this time is real?" Omar insisted. "What if there really is a chance for justice after all these years of suffering? Would it not be worth hoping for that possibility?" Amadou did not answer immediately. Deep inside his broken heart, Something small was stirring to life. It was dangerous and painful, but he could not stop it from growing. After 20 years of darkness, even the smallest candle flame looked like the sun itself. 3 months after Captain Traoré took power, an official announcement came over the prison radio that made every prisoner stop what they were doing and listen carefully. The government was forming a special commission to investigate wrongful convictions throughout Burkina Faso. The commission would visit every prison in the country to interview inmates who claimed they were innocent. Cases with evidence of corruption or fabricated charges would be reviewed by honest judges who could not be bought with bribes. The news spread through Koudougou prison like wildfire. Prisoners who had given up hope years ago suddenly came alive with excitement and nervous energy. Men who rarely spoke began sharing their stories with anyone who would listen. Everyone wanted to believe that justice might finally be possible, but they were also afraid to hope too much in case it turned out to be another cruel disappointment. When the commission arrived at Koudougou prison 2 weeks later, it was unlike any official visit the prisoners had ever seen. Instead of corrupt politicians looking for photo opportunities, these were serious legal professionals who came prepared to do real work. The team was led by a woman named Marie Ouedraogo, a respected judge who had built her career fighting corruption in the courts. Marie had short gray hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to see through lies instantly. She wore simple clothes and carried herself with quiet dignity. Unlike other officials who treated prisoners like dangerous animals, she spoke to each inmate with respect and genuine interest in their stories. Word spread quickly that this woman was different from anyone they had met before. The commission set up interviews in the prison's main hall where they could speak privately with prisoners. They brought recording equipment, legal documents, and thick files containing information about old cases. Each interview was scheduled to last at least an hour, giving inmates enough time to tell their complete stories without being rushed. Hundreds of prisoners requested interviews with the commission. Every man in Koudougou claimed to be innocent, and sorting through all the cases would take months of careful investigation. The commission members knew that some prisoners were lying, but they also knew that many genuinely innocent people were suffering behind these walls because of a corrupt justice system. When Amadou's name was called for his interview, he almost did not go. After 20 years of having his appeals rejected and his pleas ignored, he found it hard to believe that anyone in authority would actually listen to him. His cellmate Omar had to practically push him out of the cell and toward the interview room. Marie Ouedraogo was sitting behind a simple wooden table when Amadou entered the room. She looked up from her papers and smiled warmly, gesturing for him to sit in the chair across from her. There was something in her expression that Amadou had not seen in 20 years. It was the look of someone who actually cared about what he had to say. "Please tell me your story from the beginning," Marie said in a gentle voice. "Take as much time as you need. I am here to listen." Amadou started slowly, his voice rough from years of rarely speaking. He told her about his motorcycle repair shop, his pregnant wife, and his dreams of providing for his growing family. He described the rainy night when police burst into his shop with accusations he had never heard before. His voice grew stronger as he talked about the sham trial, the lawyer who barely defended him, and the evidence that was clearly manufactured. Marie listened without interrupting, taking detailed notes and asking thoughtful questions when he finished speaking. She did not dismiss his claims or treat him like a liar. Instead, she asked for specific names, dates, and details about his case that showed she was taking his story seriously. "The officers who arrested you," Marie said, looking through her files. "Can you describe them in detail? Do you remember their names or badge numbers?" Amadou's memory was still sharp about that terrible night. He gave her descriptions of all 3 officers, including the big man who had seemed to enjoy destroying his life. Marie wrote everything down and made notes about following up on these leads. "What about your original lawyer?" she asked. "Did he meet with you before the trial? Did he investigate your case or interview any witnesses?" "He never spoke to me except to say I should plead guilty," Amadou replied. "He said it would be easier for everyone if I just accepted the punishment. I told him I was innocent, but he said that did not matter because the evidence was against me. Marie's expression darkened as she made more notes. A proper defense lawyer should have fought hard to prove his client's innocence. The fact that this lawyer had essentially helped convict his own client suggested corruption at the highest levels. After an hour of detailed questions, Marie closed her notebook and looked directly into Amadou's eyes. "I want you to know that we will investigate your case thoroughly," she said. "I cannot promise any specific outcome, but I can promise that we will seek the truth no matter where it leads us." For the first time in 20 years, someone in a position of power had listened to Amadou's story and believed him. As he walked back to his cell, he felt something he had thought was dead forever beginning to stir in his chest. It was small and fragile, but it was real. It was hope. 6 months after Marie Ouedraogo interviewed Amadou, the Commission's investigation had uncovered a web of corruption that shocked even the most experienced legal professionals. They discovered that hundreds of innocent people throughout Burkina Faso had been imprisoned to cover up the crimes of wealthy and powerful individuals. The justice system had been bought and sold like merchandise at a market, with judges, lawyers, and police officers all participating in the conspiracy. The investigation into Amadou's case revealed the ugly truth that had destroyed his life 20 years earlier. Marie and her team tracked down the real vehicle thieves who had been operating a sophisticated smuggling operation across the border to Ghana. These criminals had been paying massive bribes to police officers, court officials, and government ministers to protect their illegal business. When pressure mounted to arrest someone for the thefts, they needed an innocent scapegoat to take the blame. Amadou had been chosen randomly by corrupt police officers who knew he was an honest mechanic with no money or connections to defend himself. The evidence against him had been completely fabricated, including fake witness statements and forged documents that placed him at crime scenes he had never visited. Even his fingerprints had been planted on stolen vehicles by police officers who were being paid by the real criminals. The commission discovered that prosecutor Mamadou Kone, who had handled Amadou's case, had received enormous bribes for ensuring the conviction. Bank records showed that Kone had purchased a large house and expensive car shortly after Amadou's trial, using money that could not be traced to any legitimate source. The prosecutor had deliberately ignored evidence of Amadou's innocence and pressured witnesses to lie under oath. Even more shocking was the revelation about Amadou's defense lawyer. Attorney Rasman Ouedraogo had been secretly working with the prosecution to ensure his own client's conviction. He had been paid by the same criminal organization that wanted Amadou imprisoned. This explained why Ouedraogo had provided such a weak defense and advised Amadou to plead guilty despite his obvious innocence. The commission interviewed several former police officers who had quit the force because they could not stomach the corruption anymore. These men admitted that they had been ordered to fabricate evidence against Amadou and other innocent people. One officer named Borema Ouattara broke down crying as he confessed his role in destroying innocent lives. He said he had tried to refuse the orders, but was threatened with death if he did not cooperate. Judge Antoine Zerbo, who had presided over Amadou's trial, had also been part of the conspiracy. The commission found evidence that Zerbo had received bribes to ensure guilty verdicts in cases involving innocent defendants. His bank accounts showed mysterious deposits that corresponded exactly with the timing of questionable convictions throughout his career. Medical experts hired by the commission examined the documents from Amadou's case and confirmed that many of them were obvious forgeries. Signatures had been added after the documents were created, dates had been changed, and witness statements had been written by the same person, even though they were supposed to be from different people. The entire case file was a masterpiece of deception and lies. The commission also tracked down the real mastermind behind the vehicle theft operation. Issouf Cabaret was a wealthy businessman with connections to high-ranking government officials. He had been stealing and selling government vehicles for over a decade while using his money and influence to avoid prosecution. When investigations got too close to him, he would arrange for innocent people like Amadou to be arrested and convicted in his place. As the truth emerged, Marie Ouedraogo felt both relief and anger. relief that they had finally uncovered the conspiracy that had destroyed so many lives, and anger at the scale of corruption that had infected every level of the justice system. She had seen corruption before in her career, but nothing as systematic and heartless as this network of criminals wearing the uniforms of law enforcement. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Amadou had been the victim of a carefully planned conspiracy involving dozens of corrupt officials who had been willing to destroy an innocent man's life for money. His 20 years of suffering had been caused by people who were supposed to protect citizens and uphold justice. When Marie returned to Koudougou prison to deliver the news personally, she found Amadou sitting in his usual spot by the small window. He looked up when she approached, and she could see the question in his tired eyes before he even spoke. "We have completed our investigation," Marie said, sitting down beside him. "Amadou, you are completely innocent of all charges. We have proof that your conviction was the result of corruption and fabricated evidence. Your case will be overturned immediately, and you will be freed." For a moment, Amadou could not speak. After 20 years of being treated like a criminal, hearing those words felt like waking up from a nightmare that had lasted half his lifetime. Tears began flowing down his weathered cheeks as 20 years of pain and injustice finally found their voice. The truth had emerged at last, but it could never give back the decades of life that had been stolen from an innocent man. The morning of Amadou's release felt like the first day of creation. After 20 years and 3 months behind bars, he was finally walking toward freedom. The sun seemed brighter than he remembered. The air smelled sweeter, and every sound outside the prison walls felt like music to his ears. His legs shook as he approached the massive gates that had kept him prisoner for so long. When they opened with that familiar screaming sound, this time they were opening to let him out instead of keeping him trapped inside. President Ibrahim Traoré himself had come to witness the release of wrongfully convicted prisoners. The young leader stood near the prison entrance, dressed in simple military uniform, shaking hands with each freed man as they emerged from their concrete hell. When Amadou's turn came, Traoré looked directly into his eyes and spoke words that the innocent mechanic would remember for the rest of his life. "I am deeply sorry for the injustice you have suffered," President Traoré said, gripping Amadou's thin hand firmly. "What happened to you should never happen to any citizen of our country. We failed you, and I personally apologize for every day you spent in prison for crimes you did not commit." Amadou tried to speak, but his voice was choked with emotion. 20 years of pain and bitterness seemed to pour out of him all at once. This was the first time anyone in government had acknowledged his innocence and apologized for the terrible mistake that had destroyed his life. The president's words did not erase the suffering, but they gave it meaning and recognition that Amadou had desperately needed. A government car was waiting to drive him back to his home village, 3 hours away from the prison. As they drove through the countryside, Amadou pressed his face against the window like a child seeing the world for the first time. Everything looked different after 20 years. New buildings had been constructed, roads had been improved, and he saw technology he did not recognize. The world had moved forward while he was frozen in time behind prison walls. When they reached his village, Amadou could hardly believe his eyes. Word had spread that he was coming home, and hundreds of people had gathered to welcome him. These were neighbors, customers from his old shop, and family members he had not seen in decades. Many were crying as they saw how thin and aged he had become during his imprisonment. Then he saw her. Fatima was running toward the car, her face streaming with tears. She looked older, with gray streaks in her hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of years of worry and hardship. But her smile was the same beautiful smile he had fallen in love with all those years ago. When she threw her arms around his neck, Amadou felt like he was truly alive again for the first time in 20 years. "I never stopped believing you were innocent," Fatima whispered in his ear as they held each other. "I knew you would come home to us someday." Behind Fatima stood 2 adults that Amadou barely recognized. His son was now 22 years old, tall and strong like his father had once been. The little boy who used to play with toy cars in the repair shop was now a grown man with his own job and responsibilities. His daughter Aicha was 20 years old, a beautiful young woman who looked exactly like her mother. She had been born while Amadou was in prison and had never known her father's embrace until this moment. The reunion was overwhelming with emotions too powerful for words. His children were strangers to him, but they were also his flesh and blood. They had grown up hearing stories about their father and dreaming of the day he would return home. Now that dream had finally become reality, though all of them struggled with how to rebuild relationships that had been interrupted by 2 decades of separation. President Traoré's government understood that simply releasing wrongfully convicted prisoners was not enough to repair the damage that had been done to their lives. Within weeks of Amadou's release, government officials arrived at his village with compensation packages designed to help him rebuild everything that had been destroyed by 20 years of false imprisonment. The compensation was more generous than Amadou had dared to hope for. He received enough money to purchase new tools and equipment for his motorcycle repair shop, including modern diagnostic computers and spare parts that had not existed when he was first arrested. The government also provided him with a small truck to collect broken motorcycles from customers who lived far from his shop. Most importantly, they gave his family a proper house with electricity, running water, and enough rooms for everyone to have privacy and comfort. But the most satisfying part of his new beginning was watching the corrupt officials who had destroyed his life finally face justice themselves. Prosecutor Mamadou Kone was arrested at his luxury home and charged with accepting bribes and fabricating evidence. The man who had sent innocent people to prison was now experiencing what it felt like to sit in a jail cell waiting for trial. His expensive house and cars were seized by the government to help compensate his victims. Defense lawyer Rasmain Soadogo was stripped of his license to practice law and sentenced to 10 years in prison for betraying his own clients. The courtroom was packed with people whose lives he had destroyed through his corruption. When the judge announced his sentence, several victims in the audience began crying with relief that justice was finally being served. Judge Antoine Zerbo faced the harshest punishment of all. As the man who was supposed to be the final guardian of justice, his betrayal of that sacred trust was considered especially serious. He received 15 years in prison and was ordered to repay all the bribes he had accepted over his corrupt career. Seeing the judge who had condemned him now wearing prison clothes gave Amadou a sense of closure he had never expected to feel. Even the police officers who had fabricated evidence were arrested and put on trial. The big officer who had burst into Amadou's shop that rainy night 20 years ago was sentenced to 12 years in prison. When Amadou testified at his trial, he looked directly into the man's eyes and spoke calmly about the night his life was destroyed. The officer could not meet his gaze and seemed to shrink in his chair as he heard his victim's powerful testimony. Amadou's new motorcycle repair shop became more successful than his original business had ever been. Word spread throughout the region about his story of suffering and redemption, and people came from far away to have their vehicles repaired by the man who had survived 20 years of injustice with his dignity intact. Customers trusted him completely because everyone knew he was a man of absolute honesty who had paid a terrible price for telling the truth. His relationship with his children grew stronger each day as they worked to rebuild the bonds that had been broken by his imprisonment. His son joined him in the repair shop and proved to have inherited his father's skill with engines and mechanical problems. His daughter was studying to become a teacher and often brought her books to the shop so she could spend time with the father she had never known growing up. Fatima seemed to grow younger and more beautiful as the stress and worry of 20 years melted away. She no longer had to work from dawn to dusk just to put food on the table. Instead, she could focus on enjoying her husband's company and watching their family heal from the wounds that prison had inflicted on all of them. In the evenings, they would sit together and talk about their dreams for the future, something they had not been able to do since they were young newlyweds. Amadou became a symbol of hope and justice throughout Burkina Faso. Newspapers wrote articles about his story, and radio stations invited him to speak about his experiences. He used these opportunities to praise President Traoré for having the courage to investigate corruption and free innocent prisoners. He also spoke to young people about the importance of honest leadership and never giving up hope even in the darkest times. Schools invited him to tell his story to students who were amazed that someone could survive 20 years of imprisonment and still maintain his faith in justice. Amadou would tell them that anger and hatred would have destroyed his soul, but forgiveness and hope had kept him alive. He encouraged them to work hard, stay honest, and never lose faith that truth would eventually triumph over lies and corruption. The commission that had investigated his case continued working throughout the country, freeing dozens of other wrongfully convicted prisoners and exposing corruption that reached the highest levels of government. Marie Ouedraogo, the judge who had listened to his story and believed in his innocence, was promoted to head the reformed justice system. She made sure that new laws were passed to prevent innocent people from ever being imprisoned through fabricated evidence again. Other families who had suffered similar injustices began visiting Amadou to hear his story and gain strength from his example. He would welcome them into his home and share meals while they talked about their own struggles with corrupt officials. Many of these people had given up hope completely, but seeing Amadou's success gave them courage to continue fighting for their own justice. 5 years after his release, Amadou's repair shop had grown into a small business that employed 6 people from his village. He had trained young mechanics who carried on his reputation for honest work and fair prices. The motorcycle shop had become a gathering place where people came not just to fix their vehicles, but to hear wisdom from a man who had survived the worst injustice imaginable and emerged stronger than before. On quiet evenings, Amadou would sometimes sit outside his shop and watch the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. He thought about the 20 years he had lost in prison and felt sadness for all the experiences that could never be recovered. But he also felt profound gratitude for the second chance that President Traoré's reforms had given him. His hair was now completely white, and his face bore the permanent marks of his suffering, but his eyes shone with peace and contentment. He had learned that even the darkest nights eventually give way to dawn, and that one honest leader with courage could transform an entire nation. The innocent mechanic who had been destroyed by corruption had been reborn as a symbol of justice and hope. When young people asked him about the secret to surviving injustice, Amadou would smile and point to his family working happily around him. "Never stop believing in tomorrow," he would say. "No matter how dark today might be, tomorrow can always bring justice, freedom, and joy to those who refuse to give up hope." The story of Amadou Sankara became legend throughout Burkina Faso, proving that sometimes the most ordinary people can survive extraordinary suffering and emerge as heroes who inspire entire nations to believe in the power of truth and justice.